A lonely stretch of forgotten coastline, salt on the wind, and something else, something that smells like fear and loss. A woman stands at the edge of Deadman Shoal, staring at something washed up between the rocks. Not driftwood, not wreckage. A child, barely breathing, half covered in seaweed and silence. But this isn't just a story of survival. It's about what happens when guilt refuses to stay buried, when voices from the sea come crawling back, and when the shadow of Blackbeard himself lingers over every broken promise and every ghost left behind. These are pirate stories, not meant for the faint-hearted, tales of betrayal, forgotten oaths, and the price of walking away from the sea. Legends aren't just told, they're passed from sailor to sailor. If you crave the untold tales of the sea, loyalty, loss, and vengeance, subscribe to the channel and claim your place in our crew. I still remember the way the sky changed that evening, like the sea itself had stopped breathing, holding back, waiting for something it couldn't stop. Eleanor Boone stood frozen on the edge of Deadman Shoal, her hands shaking as she stepped closer to the rocks. The body hadn't moved, but now she could see him better. Skin darkened by sun and storms, braided hair tangled with salt and threadbare hemp, and a small leather pouch hanging heavy from his neck, like it carried the weight of something no man should hold. His shirt clung to him, soaked through with seawater, and something else, a dark stain spreading slow over his left shoulder. Musket shot, no doubt about it. The boy's breath was shallow, each one a struggle. His skin burned with fever, eyes half closed but restless, like even unconscious. He was still fighting something only he could see. Eleanor hesitated. Voices from Port Royal crawled back into her mind. Warnings she'd heard too many times at the docks. Help one of them, and you'll swing for it. Doesn't matter if it's a child. Rules are rules. Island. Justice. But as she stood there, staring at the broken figure in front of her, another memory surfaced. Jacob, her husband. The way he had looked the day they buried him under the mangroves, the same helpless weight in her chest, the same air too heavy to breathe. She closed her eyes for a moment, cursing herself under her breath. Then, without another thought, she slipped her arms beneath the boy's fragile frame, lifting him like she had done with her younger brother decades ago, before the sea took him too. His head fell against her shoulder, burning hot. His blood, his fear, and something else she couldn't name, soaked into her dress. By the time she reached her cabin, the clouds had gathered over the bay like a warning. The air smelled of copper and salt, and somewhere far beyond the horizon, she thought she heard distant cannon fire, too far, too faint, but unmistakable to ears that had lived through too many storms. That night, as she placed the boy on the small cot by the fire, she caught herself staring at the leather pouch still tied around his neck. She didn't open it, not yet, but something in her, something old and restless, knew that whatever secrets it held, they wouldn't bring peace. Blackbeard's name lingered at the back of her mind, like a curse she'd heard too many times, but never spoken aloud. Men at the tavern swore that his shadow still crossed these waters, that those who broke oaths or carried things they shouldn't would find him waiting, somewhere between the tides and the fog. Eleanor pulled the blanket tighter around the boy, lit a single lantern, and sat by the door with the old musket across her lap. Because if the sea wanted him back, it would have to come through her first. Night fell like a slow, suffocating tide. The air inside the cabin turned thick, carrying the scent of salt, gunpowder, and damp, rotting wood. Eleanor worked with trembling hands, pouring cheap rum over the boy's wound, watching him flinch under the burn. She threaded the needle with old sailcloth string, the same she'd used more times than she cared to remember, stitching torn sails, patching broken nets, and now, broken flesh. As the needle pierced his skin, she whispered stories, not to comfort him, but to silence the fear clawing at her own throat. Tales of tempests that swallowed whole fleets, of nights when hunger drove men mad, of shipwrecks she had seen with her own eyes, splintered across the reefs like forgotten bones. The boy never answered, not a word. His breath stayed shallow, uneven, eyes fluttering like he hovered somewhere between this world and another. But just as she tied the last knot, just as she wiped the blood from her hands, a sound escaped him, low, cracked, almost a ghost of a word. Tawakana. The room seemed to fall silent at the weight of it. Eleanor froze, the needle slipping from her fingers. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. That name, she had heard it once before, whispered at the back. Of the tavern in Port Royal, spoken only by men too drunk to care who was listening, and even then, they dropped their voices to a near breathless murmur. Tawakana, the boy who carried secrets, secrets worth more than gold, worth more than any map or chest buried in forgotten sand. They said a single truth from his mouth could sink merchant fleets, spark chaos from Tortuga to London, ignite a war between pirates and the East India Company itself. And always, always, when that cursed name circled the room like smoke from a long-dead fire, another name followed, darker, heavier, like the sea grinding against stone. Blackbeard. Some swore he was hunting the boy. Others whispered that Blackbeard was protecting him, keeping him hidden from men who would trade anything for power. Eleanor stepped back, staring at the child now curled on her cot, eyes clenched shut, fever still burning. But there was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just a wounded castaway. He was a spark, dropped into a powder keg she hadn't asked to light. And with every gust of wind rattling the shutters, with every shadow that shifted near the door, she knew. It was only a matter of time before others came looking. The first light of dawn hadn't yet broken when she heard them. Hooves grinding over dry earth, 3 riders, moving slow but certain, like men who knew exactly where they were headed and why. Eleanor Boone stood by the window, the musket resting across her arms, breath held tight in her throat. Dust rose behind them like a warning. 2 wore the faded coats of Port Royal's dock watch, but the third, Samuel Harrow, a bounty hunter whose scars told more stories than his tongue ever would. They said he'd tracked men through storms, dragged deserters from the bottom of rum dens, and left enough widows behind to fill a churchyard. Now, here he was, at her door. The knock was sharp, not a request, a command. Eleanor opened just enough to meet his eyes, cold, yellowed like old parchment, and narrowed with suspicion. "We're looking for someone," Harrow said, voice low and flat as the sea before a squall. "Wounded, small, dark skin, answers to a name we don't say loud." Eleanor didn't flinch. "There's nothing here but dust and silence," she said, each word measured like steps on a deck about to split in 2. But Harrow wasn't a fool. His gaze drifted past her shoulder to the fireplace, where a single dark stain marked the floor beside the hearth. A smear of blood, still fresh enough to betray her. Slow, deliberate, his hand moved toward the pistol at his belt. Eleanor mirrored him, fingers curling around the musket stock, raising it just enough to let him know she wouldn't wait for him to draw first. For a breathless second, the air thickened, stretched tight like the rigging of a ship caught between 2 breaking waves. The 2 dock watchmen shifted uneasy behind Harrow, and just when it felt like one wrong blink would snap the moment into violence, one of the sailors, tired, dust-coated, and fed up with chasing shadows all night, spat on the ground and muttered, "Let it go, Harrow. The kid ain't here. Not worth dying over." Harrow's eyes lingered on her, longer than they should have, like he wasn't convinced, but knew better than to spill blood before sunrise. Without another word, he lowered his hand, turned back to his horse, and with a final look over his shoulder, they disappeared down the path, swallowed by the morning mist. Eleanor closed the door with shaking hands, bolted it and slid to the floor, but she knew better than to breathe easy. Men like Harrow didn't give up. They circled, waited, and when the time came, they came back. especially when Blackbeard's name was tangled in the hunt. The sun hung low, bleeding into the horizon. The air felt heavy, too still for that time of day. And as Eleanor knelt by the well, filling her water barrel, a sound cut through the quiet. A single, dry snap, like bone cracking underfoot, somewhere beyond. The dunes. She froze. Her fingers curled tighter around the rope, heart sinking. There, between the twisted shrubs and brittle grass, shadows moved. 4 men emerged, faces rough, eyes cold and eager, each one armed with flintlock pistols and rusted blades. They weren't soldiers. Their coats were mismatched, boots worn from too many miles of bad roads and worse choices. Men like these didn't wear colors. They wore hunger, desperation, and the scent of copper behind their smiles. Bounty hunters. The kind who cared little for names and even less for the reasons behind the hunt. Gold spoke and they listened. Without thinking, Eleanor grabbed the musket resting by the well. She didn't wait for them to shout demands, didn't wait for threats. She fired first. The shot split the air, loud enough to shake the gulls from the shoreline. One of the men dropped, grabbing at his chest, falling hard into the sand without another sound. But the others kept coming, fast, like wolves scenting blood. Inside the cabin, Tawakana heard the blast, still fevered, barely able to stand. But when the voices outside turned to shouts and the scuffle of boots drew closer to the door, he dragged himself across the floor, gripping a small knife with trembling fingers, eyes burning with something fierce, something that refused to die. By the time the second man kicked the door open, Eleanor had reloaded. Her shot went wide, but it bought her a few precious seconds. Tawakana lunged from the floor, weak but fast. His blade found flesh, shallow but enough to send the attacker stumbling back. The fight blurred, became noise and dust and raw survival. Blows landed, blood spilled across cracked floorboards and dry sand, and when the gun smoke cleared, 2 of them lay broken near the dunes, another crawled, wounded and gasping toward the tree line, and the fourth didn't move at all. Eleanor stood, breath ragged, musket empty, shoulders burning. Tawakana slumped beside her, barely conscious, but they were both still breathing. As the last light of day slipped behind the hills, she looked over the bodies scattered near her doorstep and understood, with a hollow ache in her chest, this wasn't the end. It was the first ripple, in a tide she couldn't stop. Blackbeard's name hadn't been spoken aloud that day, but she felt him, like a shadow at her back, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. That night, the wind never settled. The beams above Eleanor Boone's head creaked like restless bones, and the distant crash of waves sounded closer than they should have, as if the sea itself had crept toward her door. Tawakana lay by the fire, pale, breathing slow but clearer now, and for the first time he spoke without trembling. His voice, though young, carried the weight of things no child should know. He told her about the Yucatan coast, of his father, a chieftain whose word held power over tribes and waters alike, a man who kept company with dangerous men, pirates, smugglers, men who spoke in secrets and promises sealed with blood and gold. And then, with eyes that refused to blink, Tawakana spoke of him. Blackbeard, Edward Teach, the name that drifted from port to port like smoke from a burning wreck, the man sailors described as less than human, more shadow than flesh, a demon with cold, dark eyes and a beard thick enough to hide sins untold. According to Tawakana, Blackbeard was hunting something, not just gold, not maps or ships, but something the boy carried. Eleanor glanced at the small leather pouch still tied around his neck, realizing too late she hadn't dared ask what lay inside. Whatever it wasn't just a keepsake. It was weight, danger, a spark waiting for the right wind. As the boy spoke, her eyes drifted toward the door, and that's when she saw it. A single object nailed to the wood, A broken coin, cracked clean through the center, wrapped tight in a strip of black cloth, stained with sea salt and something darker. Her heart dropped. She didn't need a note or a voice in the dark. That symbol spoke louder than any words. It was a mark, clear and final, a message sent across waves and whispers, letting her know Blackbeard already knew where to find them, and that soon the sea would come, not with mercy, but with teeth. At first it was just a distant tremor, a low rumble, too deep to be thunder, too steady to be wind. By dawn, the air itself seemed to shudder, as if the sea had started to breathe with a new and terrible hunger. Eleanor stood at the shore, eyes fixed on the thick veil of morning fog rolling over Deadman's Shoal. And then it appeared. The Queen Anne's Revenge. Her black sails hung like wings, stretched and torn as if some beast of the deep had clawed at them. Her hull cracked and groaning, carrying more echoes than any living crew could make, and from her decks the sound of distant drums and the thud of cannons rolling in the belly of the ship. A floating shadow, gliding closer, unapologetic, uninvited, inevitable. The longboat touched shore, and from it he came. Blackbeard, his steps slow, deliberate, like a man with no need to hurry, braids tangled in soot and salt, thick with threads of burning sulfur and gunpowder, faint wisps of smoke curling from his beard, as if his very breath carried fire. No words, no greetings. He crossed the threshold of her cabin as though it had always belonged to him, filling the small space with a weight that pushed the air from Eleanor's lungs. His eyes, dark as storm water, fell on the boy. For a long moment no one spoke. Then, almost as if speaking to himself, Blackbeard's voice broke the silence, low, rough, stained with a kind of fascination. "That boy," he said, "carries more gold in his veins than all the islands put together." Eleanor opened her mouth, ready to speak, to protest, but her voice caught somewhere between fear and defiance. Before she could find her words, Tawakana pulled himself upright. Weak, trembling, but with fire still burning behind his fevered gaze. "If you're going to end me," he said, each syllable cracked but steady, "do it here." The air inside the cabin froze, and for the first time that morning, Blackbeard smiled. Not a kind smile, nor a cruel one, but something worse. The smile of a man who had just found a new game, one that promised blood and secrets, and perhaps something far more dangerous than gold. The deck of the Queen Anne's Revenge smelled of salt, smoke, and old fear. Lanterns swung overhead, casting long, restless shadows across the planks, and Eleanor Boone stood in the center of it all, surrounded by men with pistols at their belts, cutlasses on their hips, and eyes that measured life the way gamblers measure dice. No place for hesitation or mercy, but Blackbeard, he didn't raise a weapon, nor did he bark orders. He stood before Tawakana, staring down at the boy with something that felt almost like curiosity, or worse, respect, twisted into something darker. There was no violence, no chains, just words, slow, calculated, like the shifting of deep water before a storm. "Your father," Blackbeard began, voice low but steady. "He's a man who plays with fire, making promises to men like me and to others who aren't half as forgiving." Tawakana said nothing, his stare unbroken, but his hands trembled at his sides. The crew stayed silent, all eyes fixed on the boy, waiting to see if he'd break. But Blackbeard, he only smiled, that same slow, knowing smile Eleanor had seen back at the cabin. Then came the offer, the kind of offer that wasn't really an offer at all: protection. For Tawakana and for his father back in the Yucatan, in exchange for something small, just a whisper of information, details that could sink ships, unseat governors, stir panic in every corner of the Caribbean where flags dared to fly. Eleanor felt the weight of it, deep in her stomach. there was no choice. Not really. With every breath, she knew the sea had already decided for them. Her voice, when it finally came, sounded thinner than she wanted, but steady enough to carry. "I accept," she said, though the words tasted like salt and regret. Blackbeard nodded once, satisfied. The deal sealed without ink, without parchment, only spoken, the way dangerous things often are. As the longboat prepared to take her back to shore, he turned to her one last time. "You've shown more guts than half the men under my command," he said, his gaze dark, but not unkind. "If the day ever comes when you light a fire on the point of Deadman's Shoal, I'll know it's for me." Then, without waiting for her reply, he disappeared into the belly of the ship, leaving Eleanor with nothing but the cold sting of sea spray and the knowledge that her life and the boys now belonged to something far bigger than either of them could control. The moon hung low, pale and distant, as if it too wanted no part in what was about to happen. On the shore, with the tide creeping slow and cold around their boots, Eleanor and Tawakana stood side by side, their words few, their silence heavy. The Queen Anne's Revenge floated just beyond the breakers, her black sails half raised, her lanterns flickering like restless eyes watching from the dark. Crewmen moved across her decks, tightening lines, loading powder, preparing for whatever storm waited over the horizon. Tawakana, still thin, still bearing the shadows of fever, reached into the pouch at his neck and pulled out something small, fragile, but full of meaning. An eagle feather, tied with a single thread of red string, worn, weathered, but unbroken. "For you," he said, placing it in her hands. "So you'll remember." Eleanor stared at it, feeling the weight of it in her palm, but her throat tightened before she could speak. Instead, she pulled him close, held him for just a breath longer than she should. A tight, brief embrace, the kind shared between people who both know the sea never keeps promises, only debts. When they broke apart, Tawakana stepped toward the waiting boat, but before climbing in, he turned one last time. "If I survive this," he said, voice steady but low, "I'll come back, with news or with a story." Then, without another word, he disappeared into the fog, swallowed by the sea, and by the ship that had carried more ghosts than men for far too long. Eleanor stayed there, staring at the empty horizon, the feather clutched tight in her fist, listening to the distant creak of timber and the soft roll of oars, knowing deep down that nothing, not even the shoreline beneath her feet, would ever feel safe again. Morning came slow, with a pale sun struggling to break through the mist that clung to Deadman's Shoal like an old wound refusing to heal. Eleanor stood at the end of the weather-beaten dock, her hands resting on the cold barrel of her musket, her gaze lost somewhere between the horizon and the memories already turning to ghosts inside her mind. Out there, the Queen Anne's Revenge moved like a dark scar against the sea, her black sails stretched, catching wind like wings of something never meant to be caged. And on the quarterdeck, tall, unshaken, stood Blackbeard himself, a figure that looked less like a man and more like a shadow the sea had chosen to keep. His silhouette framed by smoke and salt, a silent reminder that mercy, when it came from him, always carried teeth. Tawakana stood beside him, smaller, but no longer a child. Whatever part of him had once belonged to softer things, to safety, to trust, that part stayed here, buried somewhere beneath Eleanor's feet, alongside the broken promises and quiet fears left behind. She watched until the ship disappeared, swallowed by fog and distance, and when she could see no more, she turned back to the cabin. By the door, still swaying slightly with the morning breeze, hung the eagle feather, red thread, now faded, still holding. A symbol, a warning, or maybe, just maybe, proof that in this sea of betrayals, mercy didn't come without a cost. For days after, Eleanor waited, listening to every shift in the wind, watching every dark shape that appeared near the shoreline, wondering if the next shadow would bring word of the boy, or if he'd become just another name the sea swallowed without regret. People in Port Royal spoke in low voices. Some said Blackbeard had taken the boy as a bargaining chip. Others believed he'd found something in Tawakana, something worth keeping close or destroying when the time came. And still, life on the shoal drifted on. Eleanor cleaned her rifle each morning, lit her lantern at dusk, and every night before sleep, her eyes wandered to the feather above her door, a reminder that some stories don't end with answers, only with echoes and new debts waiting to be paid. Because the truth is, no one crosses paths with Blackbeard without carrying the mark of it forever, not in their skin, but in the places sleep can't reach, where guilt, loss, and unfinished promises sit like anchors beneath the heart. Some say Tawakana survived, that he became something more than anyone expected. Others believe he disappeared, lost between ports, another soul traded for silence. And as for Eleanor, she never left Deadman's Shoal, but those who passed her cabin often wondered about the woman who kept her lantern lit, and the feather that never moved, even when the strongest winds came ashore. Now I ask you, did you already know this forgotten part of the story? And if you had been on that ship, standing beside Blackbeard, what would you have done? What other sea stories deserve to be told here? If this story touched you in any way, don't let it vanish like so many other names the sea has taken. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep hearing what was never meant to be forgotten.